Hi, I'm Larry Castle here with Ken Brown for episode 89 of That's a Good Question. What is the Church of Christ denomination? Well, welcome to this episode of That's a Good Question. I'm glad to be back this week. We were off last week because I had some health issues, and thankfully those have all been addressed. And that meant, though, we were unable to record last week. So it's been 2 weeks, and like I said, I am really glad to be back.
We're very glad to have you back at all, really. Much less, just upright.
Yeah, yes.
Much less
I'm glad
that
to be
you're
upright. Yes.
back in your host chair for the podcast. It was a close call.
Yeah. I had an artery that was just about completely blocked. They affectionately refer to it as the Widowmaker artery, but a main artery. And thankfully went to the hospital after I was having some serious chest pain in my arm and neck and stuff, some dizziness. And I knew something wasn't right. And I'd been having, I told you about, I had some issues on and off for a while. And they didn't all happen at the same time. I didn't connect that they were all related. I thought they were different things, blurry vision, for example. In fact, I told you after one of our recordings, I said I couldn't, I thought maybe you noticed something was wrong with me, but we're both busy focusing on the subject. So I told you I was kind of having blurred vision during the podcast.
I remember that, but I didn't realize you were having a problem until you informed me after the recording. So you did a good job of masking it. Or maybe it's just we're always so incoherent that you can't really tell.
You put it more kindly than I was thinking. I thought you were going to say, well, you're always just so dizzy. I didn't notice.
It's us. But it might explain some of the comments that we get from some of our listeners.
Exactly. Well, yeah.
But really, seriously, we're glad that the medical team was able to take care of it, get you back on your feet, and really do so in just a few days.
Yeah, it's amazing, really. And I have like a tiny, it looks like a scratch is the only souvenir. Besides, they put a stent in that artery. It was just that procedure, a couple days in the hospital. And I think I was in longer than most people who have it because I just had some complications with it. But pretty much back to normal.
That's great.
I haven't got the all clear from the doctor yet, but I feel better than I did before I went in because I didn't realize I'd been having that trouble.
Right.
So you and I, we both got family histories. You've had the similar, you actually had 4 stents put in.
Correct. Yep.
Yeah, so just very thankful that this is something that we can live with, live through, which a generation ago maybe we wouldn't have been able to. Yeah. So both of us, the outlook is good, right?
Yep.
Right. So today then we are back and we have a question from a viewer that we want to answer. So our viewer writes in and says, we have some good Christian friends who are diehard Church of Christ members. And while I believe that the Bible tells us to be baptized, I believe we will go to heaven even if we aren't baptized. They believe that no one will go to heaven without being baptized. The thief on the cross wasn't baptized, and there are other examples. So they write in, let's about that question, let's start by you sharing what you know about the history of that denomination.
Well, the history of that for me includes personal experience because I have many family members who are Church of Christ. So
now in previous episodes, you've talked about how your background is Pentecostal. So you mentioned many times to me. So which is it? Pentecostal, Church of Christ?
Well, yes, it's both. I'm a bit of a mongrel religiously, but let me say that the new stent appears to have made you a bit more aggressive.
I've got full blood flow to the brain now.
I'm going to have to see how this goes in the days ahead. But seriously, as you said, my family's religious heritage is largely Pentecostal. In fact, all of my immediate family background is Pentecostal. My dad was a Pentecostal pastor, and I attended his church there every week, multiple times each week, until I turned 19, and I determined that Baptists were closest to what the New Testament teaches in terms of doctrine and governance, in terms of what we believe and how we're governed. But I also had, and I have, many aunts and uncles and my grandparents on my mom's side who are Church of Christ. My grandfather was an elder in the Church of Christ in Harold, Kentucky, just outside of Pikeville.
You probably have mentioned that to me. I just don't remember that.
Yeah,
Okay.
yep. The church met on Toller's Creek, where my mom grew up, and where several of her brothers and sisters lived. And her mom and dad, my grandma and grandpa, still lived in that same house when I was growing up. And when we would visit down there during every summer of my upbringing, on Sunday, we would go down to the Church of Christ, which was just down the road that ran along Toller's Creek. And I remember entering the small, white, traditional-looking building. It had a sign over the door that read, Church of Christ meets here. And I liked it because it suggested something really that's true, that the church is not the building, but the people who are in it. It carried over for me when we moved into our own building. And we insist, don't we, on not calling the building the church. We often refer to it here as the ministry center.
Yeah, that's served us well from the days when we were kind of nomads moving from building to building, and everybody just knew that.
Yes.
To now we have a permanent meeting place. It's all the more important.
Yeah, that's right. So when we didn't have a building, it encouraged us because the church is not a building. And then having created that mindset, when we got a building, we now don't mistake the building for the church. One of my favorite uncles, Uncle Bert, who passed several years ago, but who was from down there in the Pikeville area, married one of my mom's sisters. They moved to Michigan like my mom and dad did, and he was an elder in his Church of Christ up here in Michigan, and he and I would have doctrinal discussions from time to time. He was very kind, he was patient, deeply sincere. He had an influence on me, though I wish I had more of the kind and patient rub off on me.
So did that family connection motivate you to look into what the Church of Christ is and how it started and all that?
It did, yeah. After all, at age 18 and 19, as I was contemplating leaving my Pentecostal church, my dad had passed, and his successor, another uncle, my dad's brother, had been pastor. He was no longer leading the church either, that uncle of mine. So the church was no longer run by the family, so to speak. And I had been having questions about what we taught for a few years, questions especially related to eternal security. My Pentecostal church did not believe that you are eternally secure, you could lose your salvation. And I was sharing those doubts with my mom, and the truth is, she didn't have much problem with me leaving the Pentecostal church because honestly, she had never really fully bought in herself. She grew up Church of Christ. Her dad was an elder in the Church of Christ, and she always had great, great respect for the Church of Christ and the people that she knew in that, including her dad, her brother-in-law as elders, and her mom and sisters as faithful members, and they were genuinely good people. So she urged me to become Church of Christ. But whatever you do, don't become Baptist for reasons that we'll explain later.
Parents, whatever you do, don't prescribe what exactly not to do like that. No.
And they go the opposite.
Yeah,
right?
you're basically saying, here's what you ought to do.
Yeah, exactly. That's true. So it might even be next week that we'll get into why my mom didn't want me to, but she didn't. So as I looked into the origins of the Church of Christ, I found that it began in the 1800s with what's historically called the Restoration Movement. So those of you that are interested in the history, if you Google Restoration Movement, then you'll get information about the origins of the Church of Christ. Restoration meaning restore. And the idea was to restore the church to the simplicity taught in the New Testament. Strip away the excess baggage that had gathered over centuries, lighting candles and incense and other things not found in the practice of the New Testament church. And they, the Church of Christ, claimed to have successfully peeled the excesses away and to have arrived at the doctrine and practice of the true church. In fact, they claimed the Church of Christ started in 33 AD. On the day of Pentecost. And so they would actually object to the way we've worded today's question, what is the Church of Christ denomination? Because they don't believe they are a denomination. Everyone else is, or pretty much everyone else is, the Methodists, the Catholics, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, and yes, Baptists. You're all a bunch of denominations from their perspective, Church of Christ perspective, but we existed before you all got into that game.
Yeah, you said the Church of Christ began, they say that it began in 33 AD.
Right.
I mean, in a purely literal understanding of that statement, I would agree with that. Yeah. The Church of Christ did begin actually on Pentecost.
This is true. And they also, this is another kind of curious claim, though, they will say that name, Church of Christ, is the only name. A lot of them will. Mm-hmm. And that was true of my grandfather. That was true of this wonderful uncle I had, but they were very strident about that. Sometimes Church of Christ folk will refer to themselves as pre-denominational. Mm. That is, we existed prior to the invention of denominations.
Yeah, if you're paying attention to that, that's quite a claim to say we are the true church, right. And not just like we do our best to follow yes. New Testament doctrine, but we are the only church. Yeah. The one expression of everything that started back in Acts chapter 2 on the day of Pentecost. Right. In fact, with all due respect to your family, it seems kind of arrogant. If you say that we're pre-denominational, mm-hmm. kind of like we're above the fray from all this mess you guys mm-hmm. have all created. Mm-hmm. We have just been keeping the faith. We are the true expression of the church.
Yeah, I agree with that. Now my family never used the pre-denominational label, but that was the import mm-hmm. of what they believe. And though they're humble and good people, it is a bit arrogant to say that the only expression of genuine Christianity that's valid, as some Church of Christ folks do, is what they practice.
So is that pre-denominational term, is that more like modern marketing that they use?
I think so.
I've
seen that more recently, in the last 20 years anyway.
It's a catchy way to say it.
It is.
Yeah. Okay. So kind of like, all right. So you say some Church of Christ do this. Wouldn't they all say the same thing since they're all unified in what they believe and practice?
Well, go figure, but that experiment in restoration didn't quite restore full unity after all. The Church of Christ split. They split.
So how can they split if they're identified as this cohesive unit in some way, a denomination?
Well, there you go. Exactly. The truth is they are a denomination. Mm-hmm. Since denomination just means giving a name to, denominating. Okay. Mm-hmm. In our political environment, some might be familiar with RINO, R-I-N-O, Republican in name only. Mm-hmm. Another way to say that would be he or she is a nominal Republican, because nominal means having a name. Mm-hmm. The name Church of Christ represents distinctive beliefs and practices, and so is in fact a denomination. Mm-hmm. Now, what many people mean by denomination is a hierarchy, an organization that has layers of authority. And many church denominations do, beyond just having a name that describes some practices and beliefs, they do have that hierarchy as well, but that's not required to be a denomination. In fact, Baptists have no such hierarchy. Mm-hmm. And so really in every way that the Church of Christ says they're distinct from a denomination, well, guess what? So are we.
So there's no national organization governing body for Church of Christ?
That's correct.
So they are like independent Baptists in that sense.
Exactly right.
Okay.
That's right. They're autonomous. Each of the churches are autonomous like ours are.
Gotcha.
Yeah. But in truth, we're both denominated. Mm-hmm. That is, we're both named for distinctive beliefs and practices. So I'd recommend that our Church of Christ friends just give up the we're not a denomination thing. Mm-hmm. But you see it on just about every one of their church websites. If they don't use the pre-denominational, they most definitely will say, hey, we're not a denomination. Mm-hmm. And what's more, they have many of the other trappings of a denomination. They have their own publishing house, Christian Standard Publishing. Look it up. They have their own schools. Here in Michigan, Rochester University used to be called Michigan Christian College, but that's a Church of Christ university. Cincinnati Christian University, Church of Christ University. Even Pepperdine University in Malibu, California, one of the most beautiful pieces of real estate in the country. Literally, Church of Christ origins there as well. And they have their own publication, something called the Christian Herald.
Yeah, so you describe all that, and it's easy to understand then how they could split, because they are, in fact, an identifiable entity, like you said, a denomination. So what kind of things split them up?
Well, as you try to restore the Restoration Movement, the beliefs and practices of the New Testament, as they tried to do that, it got a little complicated. Especially if you fail, as some of them did, to make some important and careful distinctions that we've actually made on our podcast in the past. For example, in restoring to not only what the New Testament said to do, questions came up like, well, Well, what about musical instruments? So what do we do with that? Where in the New Testament do you find the church using instruments? Well, you don't. So many strict restorationists, now we're trying to restore to what they did in the New Testament, said, well, you can't use instruments. And that's why to this day, you can go into a Church of Christ building on a Sunday for worship, and the singing will be a cappella. There will be no instruments at all. The Church of Christ for my family down Tuller's Creek, just you go in and it's just everybody singing, voices, but no instruments at all. In fact, there's a cable TV show that out of Oklahoma called In Search of the Lord's Way. I've run across this a couple of times, and it's on one of the kind of off channels, kind of the local channel that just sort of any number of things you might find on the local cable channel, just reserved for, free airtime. And I think it is free airtime because it's religious broadcasting.
Okay.
And they're not selling and that kind of thing. But it's called In Search of the Lord's Way. And it begins and ends with beautiful singing, actually, but no instruments. And that's because it's a Church of Christ broadcast. Now, no instruments is practicing a version of what some of our listeners might recognize, something called the Regulative Principle, coming out of the Protestant Reformation from 500 years ago. So the Regulative Principle is that our worship is to be regulated by what the New Testament tells us. But if you just say the Regulative Principle, and we can only do what the New Testament tells us, and that's how we'll be regulated, and you forget to distinguish, and this is what we've talked about in the past on the podcast, function and form, then that's going to create a problem.
Some of our old timers, longtime CBC members, just got a twitch when we said that, because for the longest time we would talk about those concepts and people would get them mixed up.
Right,
which is form, which is
yeah.
function.
All right, tell me again. Right.
Yeah.
The truth is, though, if you get that right, if you can get that right in your mind, you can be a restorationist. Like I am. I want to restore to. I want to be what the New Testament says we're supposed to be, right? What Bible believer would say otherwise? You can be that and still use music if you make that function-form distinction.
Function, what we do, form, how we go about it.
Yes, exactly. Okay. So make music. Well, is that going to be with just voices, or is that going to be with instruments? That's a form. That's the way we do it. I think we should be seeking to restore the doctrine and the practice of the New Testament. If we are, in fact, Bible believers, we believe in the authority of the Bible. And I think our church does that. We only perform functions that were given in the New Testament. But the forms that those take are not necessarily found in the New Testament. Like membership. We talked about membership on one of our podcasts. Is membership biblical? Well, membership is a function, but then the form of that can take all kinds of a variety of ways. And they don't need to be found in the New Testament if you recognize that the Bible is written and gives us our functions in a way that leaves to us the responsibility of coming up with wise forms, methods to carry that out. Let's say you're a voices-only advocate, in the Church of Christ. Well, okay, now what about hymn books? Do you find in the New Testament that they were using hymn books? Are you okay to use a hymn book?
Scrolls?
yeah, right. So what are you going to do?
I guess Codex was that in use in the early church?
But do you even find that mentioned, though, that's the way they were doing their singing?
Right,
Sing and make melody in your hearts, but it didn't tell you how they did that, right? So you still have a problem. So it's better to say the Bible requires we carry out the function of singing, but we develop forms to practically do it, like instruments or hymn books, or in our day, having screens. So for many in the churches of Christ, practices not present in accounts of New Testament worship are not then permitted in the church. But in contrast, others decided they may consider any practice that's not actually expressly forbidden, and they ended up splitting.
Okay, wow. So most, if not all, churches of Christ have no instrumental music?
That's right.
So what became of the other faction? Who are these guys?
They are the Christian church. And they not only have instruments. In my experience, and I know a number of them in our area, they not only have instruments, usually it's full-on rock or whatever is popular. They almost always have Christian church in their name, usually preceded by something like such and such community Christian church. But whether community or some other adjectives, the denominator, no pun intended, is Christian church.
Okay, that's actually the one I'm more familiar with. And so I think the Church of Christ offshoots I know of probably fall into that category.
Yes, that's
Okay.
correct. But we have right in our own town, in our own city here, one that is just straight up Church of Christ. And most of the cities around us in our area, and most of our listeners, I think if you looked in your area, you would find churches with the name Church of Christ on them.
Wow. So is that it then? Their claim to fame or claim to infamy is no instruments or a historical split over the use of instruments?
No. In fact, more importantly, they tried to restore to New Testament belief and practice. And again, they went awry by misunderstanding the connection. And here's the big issue, and perhaps their biggest distinctive, the connection between baptism and salvation.
Yeah.
And in fact, this is the most important distinctive of both the churches of Christ and Christian churches, though it is maddeningly difficult to pin many of them down on what they believe about the necessity of baptism for salvation. Now, some are very straightforward with it. My family, my grandfather when he was alive, my uncle when he was alive, they were very straightforward. It's necessary. You must be baptized in order to be saved. But that is their distinctive belief. Baptism is required for salvation. But some of them, and it's especially the ones that you said you're most familiar with in the Christian church variety, because after all, they're the ones that are more up to date. They're the ones with a more outreach mindset. They're the ones that are more seeker sensitive, so to speak.
Yeah, I was going to say the outreach mindset. It is a good spin on that, but marketing, almost marketing driven,
right.
would be the
I
negative
think that's right.
side of that.
That's right. Yep. And so those I've interacted with tend to mute and downright obscure what they actually believe about the necessity of baptism for salvation.
Yeah, I remember you talking about that with me a few years back. It's interesting, it's sad, but I think would be good for our listeners to hear some details about that.
Yeah, years ago, I had a couple, decades ago, that left our parent church. So this was while I was still at our parent church, before this church that we now pastor was formed. And we had a couple leave that church. They hadn't joined. They had been visiting our church. They seemed to like it. And we were kind of surprised when they weren't around for several weeks. We contacted them. We said, hey, is there any questions we can answer? And they said, oh, we found this other place. And this other place was one of these Christian churches in the area. And I knew what they believed. I knew what they believed about baptism. And I knew this couple did not believe that. And I told our senior pastor that I served under at the time, I said, I know those people do not believe what that church they are going to believes. And he called them, and he never does that, but he called them again. And he said, I never do this, but, you've chosen to go to this place, and we've learned a little bit about what you believe, and they're not the same. So we're just letting you know that. And they said, wow, well, thank you for letting us know. But we didn't hear from them. Years later, we've then, at this point now, started this church. And guess who walks in? This couple walks in. And I said, whatever became of you guys? And they were there at that church for years. And they said that, they never heard anything, that the church kept it so quiet that this otherwise astute couple never detected it. But they noticed that they did have baptism every single week, which is a clue, by the way. And then one day, an older man in the church was teaching a Sunday school class, and he just out and out taught on it. So they left, they came to us, and they were with us, in fact, until they moved out of state. But over the years, we've had others come. And when I asked what they were told about baptism at this Christian church from which they were coming, and there are several of them in our area, it was the same thing. It was muted. And so I contacted one of the pastors of one of those Christian churches. And I said, you have people confused about what you believe. We had this email exchange, and it was like trying to hold on to a slippery eel, as Dr. McHugh, my theology professor, used to say, a slippery eel, to pin him down on something, and to pin him down on something so fundamental as the requirements for salvation.
Yeah.
And I later had an exchange with another different Christian church pastor. It was the same frustrating experience. Here's a quote from an email that pastor sent to me. Here's what it says. This is a quote. I have the email. It is wrong to teach either of the following, he says. You don't need to be baptized to be saved. So he says it's wrong to teach that you do not need to be baptized to be saved. Next line, that you have to be baptized to be saved. It's wrong to teach either of those.
So you're not supposed to teach anything definitively about baptism.
It was the most frustrating thing. I went back and forth with him. I said, listen, let's define what a contradiction is. Let's,
Oh my, that can be insulting, but sometimes you have to do that.
I said, and I was respectful. I said, listen, thanks for engaging in this, but I'm really trying to get at what do you believe here? But listen, let me just say to you, friends, if your pastor cannot give you a straight answer to the question, is baptism necessary for salvation? Get a new pastor and do it right away. So let me answer it, and then show in our next episode why baptism is not necessary for salvation. I'm answering the question straight up. Is baptism necessary for salvation? The answer is no. One who is born again, one who is saved, converted, a Christian, all of these synonymous terms that we use, you are so by faith alone in the person and work of Jesus Christ, and will go to heaven whether baptized or not.
All right. That seems like a pretty good place to pause then until next week. It's as clear as could be. So we'll stop there, and we'll talk next week about the passages that the Church of Christ and the Christian Church, when they're willing to engage in the question, that they use to defend this belief in the necessity of baptism for salvation. Okay. So, well, thank you for joining us this week for That's a Good Question. We try to publish these every Saturday afternoon at 2. And just to make sure that you know when new episodes are coming out, why don't you hit the subscribe button, hit that notification bell below this video so you get an alert every time we publish new material. And we look forward to seeing you in the next one. If you have a question you'd like us to consider, you can send that in to our email address, info@cbctrenton.com, or text it to us at 97000.